Here's some stats that are evidence of the problem that we're about to explore, this capability strain. And before we start looking at the percentages, just note the labels: emotionally detached, downright miserable. Those are not labels we should be using to talk about work. Those are labels that I used to talk about my first marriage. But look at the percentages. They've dropped, these percentages, over the last few years. Dropped 3%, 20% engaged, dropped from 23% 4 years ago. And in fact, it's not been moving much over the last 8 years. It's stayed between 19 and 23% engaged. We're not making work better in general for people. And there's been a marked drop since AI became mainstream about 4 years ago. And notably, manager engagement has dropped significantly since then. 9% drop in manager engagement. Why is this? Well, we see a flattening of organizational structures. We see greater spans of control, and we see a lot of fusion and lack of clarity about how AI impacts work. Because if AI handles more process work, and it does that very, very well, the remaining human work becomes more emotionally and cognitively demanding. It requires a slightly different skill set, which we're going to start to explore today. And often work feels a bit like this, especially if you're a manager and you are either a manager or you work closely with people who feel like this. I didn't really understand any of this until I experienced it myself, something I'll tell you about more than once today. There was a constant sense for me that I was responsible for things I didn't fully control. And I remember thinking at the time, is it supposed to feel like this? The middle of organizations is where reality shows up. The middle is that translation layer between strategy and reality, converting one into the other. Strategy sounds really neat at the top of organizations, but it rarely arrives neat anywhere else in the organization. And managers don't just pass messages on, they interpret them. And when that goes wrong, you don't just get disagreement, you get something far worse than that. You get confusion. And that's the bit we still underestimate. Work is emotional before it's logical. People don't resist change because they've done some kind of cost benefit analysis on it. People resist change because they're unsure or they don't feel safe. And then we make it harder because we say we want better leaders. We fill people's time with everything except leadership. So where do we go from here? A practical example of this comes from my own experience. I worked in a UK voluntary sector organisation of around 500 people, and I spent more than a decade there as a middle manager. There was a strong executive team above me. They had clarity of purpose, clear responsibilities, and access to lots of development. Below me sat around 40 frontline managers and supervisors. They also had clear expectations and structured development. But for us in the middle, it felt fuzzy. There were 10 of us, and it often felt like we existed to absorb whatever didn't neatly belong anywhere else. Strategy was above us, delivery was below us. Somewhere in the middle, we were expected to make all of that work. We had influence, unclear authority. A responsibility with not always clarity. And when things became messy, which was often, there wasn't a process manual for that. The challenge that we faced was not technical competence, but human capability. And some middle managers struggled not because they were bad managers. They were people trying to navigate ambiguity without support for the kinds of skills the role actually requires. And the kind of skills the role actually requires, things like judgment, emotional intelligence, communication, sense making, and the ability to interpret complexity for other people. The real work of managers is not about delivering plans, translating uncertainty, helping people to understand what does this mean for me, creating clarity when it doesn't fully exist yet, helping anxious people feel calmer and making decisions without perfect information, holding tension without passing panic on. So I changed the way that we thought about development. Rather than focusing on purely technical management skills, we invested in the human side of leadership, creating opportunities for coaching, reflection, peer learning, practical development, giving middle managers more opportunities to learn together, think together, and solve problems collectively. And then what happened? People became more confident, operating with ambiguity. Communication improved, decisions became better, relationships strengthened, and we stopped feeling isolated. The organization started functioning more smoothly because we had become better, and the invisible work sits between strategy delivery. Because when work gets messy, modern work is very messy in many organizations. Success depends much less on technical expertise and more on human judgment.